Throughout history, there have been many different execution methods used to take the life of someone who had been condemned. One of the most prolific methods was the gallows, and on this thousands of people were condemned in different ways. In the medieval and Tudor times, the gallows was used to slowly strangle someone, but then as different executioners innovated and developed quicker ways of killing, then the drop was introduced. Inside of Hungary and Czechoslovakia during World War II, there was even a pole or a post used to condemn someone by hanging. But throughout the centuries there were different gallows created, and different methods used with slight variations. One gallows even shot prisoners up into the air, rather than going through a trapdoor. In this documentary we will look at the history of the gallows, and the different types of gallows used throughout the years. Welcome to the Fortress. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. There are a number of specific methods in which hanging was used for executions. One of the most common which has been used is a short drop, which is where a prisoner would stand on a raised platform. This could be a stool, ladder or other platform. Then this was taken away and someone was left dangling from the rope and the noose. They are suspended by their neck and the weight of the victim tightens the noose, and mostly people die through strangulation, and it can take around 10 or 12 minutes for someone then to be pronounced dead. Throughout history this has been used for the executions of many, and was part of the execution method hanged, drawn and quartered, in which following a number of minutes where the condemned person was hanged using the short drop, when they were almost dead they were cut down for their execution ordeal to then continue. One man who did escape this was Guy Fawkes, who whilst he was being led up the ladder to be hanged by the short drop, he jumped off the scaffold and actually broke his neck, but then his body was still subjected to the execution anyway. It was the most common method used on the gallows before the 1850s, but then executioners looked for other methods as they wanted to make execution methods quicker, as a short drop could take some time and was considered less humane. Another variant of the gallows which was used in Austro-Hungary and in the two countries following their separation and independence was the pole hanging. But inside of Hungary following the Second World War, outside the Academy of Music in Budapest, a number of condemned war criminals who supported the Nazis would be executed using the pole method. The gallows with this was replaced by a stake, and someone would be executed on this. It had a number of steps and was more complicated. First the condemned would be stood on the 3-metre high pillar or pole, and a rope was then tied around their feet and then through a pulley at the bottom of the stake. Then the condemned was hoisted to the top of the pole through a sling across their chest. Then a noose was looped around their neck and was secured to a hook at the top of the pole, and when the chest sling was released, the victim then plunged down, and the executioner would put his hand between the jaw of the prisoner to increase the force on the neck, and then would desiccate the neck of the condemned. One famous case of this being used was on Nazi war criminal Karl Hermann Frank, who was believed executed 1,000 people using this method during his time in control during the Second World War. Another method used was the standard drop, which is where a victim would drop between 4 and 6 feet, and this was developed by an Irish doctor named Samuel Houghton. It was devised as a way of speeding up executions and was considered more humane, as a drop was supposed to be enough to break the victim's neck, causing quicker death. This was used following the Second World War to execute those Nazi war criminals mentioned earlier following the Nuremberg trials, such as Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hans Frank and Ernst Kaltenbrunner. The account of Ribbentrop's execution alludes to the executioner's mistakes, as it says, "The hangman botched the execution and the rope throttled the former foreign minister for 20 minutes before he expired." Another account said, "The trap fell open and with a sound midway between a rumble and a crash, Ribbentrop disappeared. The rope quivered for a while, then stood tautly straight." We know that those executions at Nuremberg in their most extreme did not go right due to problems with the rope and the length, and the drops which were calculated were incorrect, or they did not achieve the velocity and speed which was needed to snap the necks. This has led to John C. Woods getting a notorious reputation for being a botching executioner, who at one point, it's believed, even pulled down on one of the bodies to finish off the execution behind the curtain. But what is considered possibly the most successful execution method on the gallows was developed in Britain and was known as a long drop. William Marwood is the executioner who developed this, and instead of everyone falling the same distance through a trapdoor, the height and weight of the condemned was used to determine how much slack in the rope would be needed to ensure that the distance dropped would be enough to snap the neck. But the worry with this was that the head could come off if calculated poorly, and there needed to be careful placement of the knot of the noose. This went wrong with Blackjack Ketchum's execution, as the outlaw would lose his head when he plunged through the trapdoor. This also happened when the murderess, Ava Duggan, in 1930, had a botched execution in Arizona. One man who was considered very skilled in this practice was Albert Pierpoint, the British executioner who would execute hundreds of Nazis under British jurisdiction, and he would, it's believed, execute some in just a matter of seconds, with the record being 7 seconds from entering the execution chamber until the drop was opened. The British were keen on speed with executions to avoid the mental stress of the impending execution on the victim. Throughout history, some added pain has been added onto the gallows, as some countries would, whilst one was on the gallows, cut and inflict other serious wounds to the body. This could obviously lead to someone bleeding out. Of course, it is still used as an execution method all around the world, but in England the process dates back from the Anglo-Saxon period. There were many hangmen who would work across Britain, and the last British execution using hanging took place in 1964. Hangings were often performed in public before, and this was only changed in 1868, when they occurred inside of special execution chambers, which were then set up in prisons, away from the gaze of the public. There were a number during the Second World War who were executed in this manner, including traitors such as John Amory and William Joyce, Lord Haw-Haw. As time went on, the amount of capital offences diminished, and the last woman to be hanged was Ruth Ellis, whose execution took place on the 13th of July 1955, with the last hanging being carried out altogether, as mentioned, in 1964. In America, hanging was brought over by the Puritans, and capital punishment does vary from state to state. But the largest mass execution in America saw 38 Sioux Indians executed on the gallows, and some of the most infamous executions using this method saw 1 woman and 3 men executed for their involvement in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Shockingly also, it has been used for lynchings in certain states, and throughout history there have been many people who were strung up in trees just for the colour of their skin, and these horrifically would gather a large crowd. There is a case where throughout the years someone has been hanged on the gallows upside down also. This was used mostly as a form of torture and was used in medieval Germany. The gallows is considered one of history's most common execution methods, but it was also a rather horrific one, as throughout the years executions did take some time, and the ordeals for the condemned could last a long time. Efforts were made to speed this up, but of course things could go wrong very often. Executions throughout the centuries took place all over Europe, but Tyburn became a place which gained a notorious reputation. It was the original junction of a Roman road, and was seen as a place where people would pass by bodies, which would send a clear message to people to behave themselves and stay in line. The first recorded execution at Tyburn near to a stream occurred in 1196, as William Fitz-Osbert, a rebel leader, was hanged after being dragged naked behind a horse to Tyburn. But in the centuries after, it became a place synonymous with executions, and Henry VIII would also use Tyburn to execute dozens of rebels. There were many execution methods deployed at Tyburn. As mentioned, the harrowing hanged, drawn and quartered, which is often said to have been one of the most brutal execution methods used in history, was performed at Tyburn, as was burning at the stake, which was also performed upon heretics or religious criminals. But the most common method of execution was hanging. Usually with executions, the last day of the condemned was marked by a religious event or day of importance. Every Sunday before the executions, a sermon was preached nearby at a chapel in Newgate, and those who were not connected with the execution could attend. On the night before the execution, the sexton of St Sepulchre Church recited religious verses outside the walls where the condemned were, and then the condemned the next morning heard prayers and received the sacrament if they wanted to. On the day of the execution, they were then taken to the Tyburn gallows from Newgate Prison in a horse-drawn open cart. They were paraded 3 miles from Newgate to Tyburn, and the streets were usually lined with people who saw the procession of the dead. The cart usually rested at the Bowl Inn pub in St Giles, where the condemned was allowed a final drink of alcohol, of either a strong liqueur, strong ale, or a glass of wine. But then the cart continued to Tyburn, and when it got there, the condemned would be taken up onto the scaffold in front of almost a huge carnival-like celebration and gathering. There were huge stands erected for people to see the execution, and people were hanging out of windows, wishing to get a glimpse of today's proceedings. The wealthy even paid for the best seats, and before the execution, the condemned was allowed to say a few final words. In this they usually admitted their guilt, and absolved others of their guilt and possible fate, and the authorities also wanted them to apologise for their crimes to God. But when the normal gallows stood at Tyburn, the cart would be led up to the gallows, and the condemned was then stood on the cart before the executioner secured the noose around their neck. The cart was then driven away, and the condemned would be left hanging, and it was death by slow strangulation. There was no drop, just a twitching and struggling body of someone fighting for their life. Sometimes, if an ordeal for a criminal was to be made much more severe, then the victim would be cut down and hanged many times before they then died, and this also happened with hanging, drawing and quartering, as the victim was cut down before they died. But Tyburn is mostly remembered in this way for the fact the Tyburn tree stood there, a triangular gallows which was made for the sole purpose of being able to hang more people at once. The Tyburn tree had 3 legs or beams which were joined up to create a triangular structure, where people could be hanged on the different sides. This was a huge structure too, and gave everyone a good view of the proceedings. Mass execution was performed often, and during one of these on the 23rd of June 1649, there were 23 men and 1 woman hanged at the same time, and they were taken to the tree on 8 carts. Following executions on the tree, there would usually be fights breaking out between the family of the condemned and anatomists, who wanted to carry out dissections of the executed, as they were allowed to seize the bodies legally. The first person to be executed on the Tyburn tree was a Roman Catholic named John Story, and the tree was created during the reign of Elizabeth I, a time of great religious intolerance. There were many Catholics who were executed on the tree during her reign. One of the strangest executions to be carried out on the Tyburn tree did not even include the hanging of a living person. Following the restoration of the monarchy, and during the reign of Charles II, the new king wanted to punish those men who had signed his father's death warrant, and were the true powers behind the execution of King Charles I. With this, Oliver Cromwell, the former Lord Protector, Henry Ireton, Cromwell's son-in-law, and Judge John Bradshaw were all dug up from their burial sites as they had died in the years before, and these coffins were cracked open, and the remains were then paraded throughout London. They were taken to the Tyburn tree, where they were then hanged in chains, and their heads were even then hacked off their decaying corpse, with the heads then placed on spikes, and the bodies thrown into the pit, with many other body parts. The Tyburn tree was replaced and mended a number of times throughout the centuries, because of the sheer amount of people who were being executed upon it. During the execution of Catherine Noland, in June 1759, it was said that, when she came to Tyburn, all the crossbeams had been pulled down, so she was in fact tied up on the top of one of the upright posts, and hung with her back to it. There were thousands of people who came out to see the hangings on the Tyburn tree, and for many this even became a morbid business opportunity for them, as they sold food to the crowds, and also programmes containing information about who the condemned were, and people wanted to find out more about who they were watching hang. Because of the executions in this area, even phrases entered the English language, such as to dance a Tyburn jig, which was a euphemism for someone being hanged. The Tyburn tree was last used on the 3rd of November 1783, when a highwayman named John Austin was hanged for his crimes in front of an absolutely huge and colossal crowd. But then these hangings were moved across to Newgate Prison to be performed there, as it was said to have been safer. But it would not be long before further public disorder and shocking behaviour led to executions being carried out within the prison, away from the eyes of the public. But today on the famous shopping street, a small plaque marks the site of the iconic triangular gallows where it stood, as do the 3 oak trees that were planted in a triangle on purpose. It was a harrowing place over the centuries, and over the years thousands of people were executed on the very spot where today millions of people pass by unaware of the past every single week. It was claimed that the first recorded use of the new drop gallows was at Tyburn, the infamous site of the Tyburn tree, the triangular gallows, that could condemn many people at once. The gallows here was aimed to slowly strangle a prisoner, as during the proceedings a rope was passed over the wooden beams of the triangular structure. For centuries before in Britain, death by hanging usually meant an executioner strangling the life out of someone, but the new drop offered a different method of execution, with the prisoner plunging to their death through a drop. Death was usually at this time still carried out by asphyxiation as it was before, but instead of an executioner choking the life out of someone, the drop was what tightened the noose, and then someone was strangled as their body weight tightened the rope. Death could take place after a number of minutes, and people were still known to have moved. Some prisoners went limp straight after the drop, and did not suffer much at all. But the first new drop scaffold that emerged at Tyburn was one that was covered in black material, and it had a small flight of stairs for the condemned to access the platform by. There were 2 upright beams from the scaffold and a crossbeam completing it, and under the beam was a small box, which was just over 3 feet tall. This was designed to fall into the scaffold, and then leave the condemned suspended by their neck. For this first execution there were even some black cushions brought, and it was Earl Ferrers who lost his life on the device. He was allowed some time to pray before the execution with his priest, and just after midday the execution was performed, and this did not go very well, as the mechanism malfunctioned, leaving Earl Ferrers' feet on the platform. For some time he struggled, but he then went still. But despite the teething problems, the new drop gallows was adopted by many different prisons and authorities, and there were other gallows which replaced the outdated cart and gallows, where someone was taken on the back of a cart, and then the noose was secured around their neck, and the cart was then driven off. The gallows of Newgate Prison had a number of different features, such as wooden boards, which would hide the legs and lower body of the condemned, as they struggled when the drop was released. These gallows were usually created on the top of gatehouse roofs of county jails, and the procession of the dead, on the back of a cart, became a thing of the past. There were between 1783 and 1874 1,120 people who were executed using short drop hanging on the new drop gallows at Newgate Prison, and some prisons even had more secluded execution structures away from the eyes of the public. Following the passing of the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868, all executions had to take place within the walls of county prisons, and the existing gallows was used and was set up inside of prison yards, away from the eyes of the public. Some prisons had execution sheds erected in the exercise yards to carry out these executions, and usually the trapdoor was created over a pit. Later the long drop would be used, and this pit would be dug deeper to allow a prisoner to fall a longer distance through the gallows, but having the gallows in a separate building away from other prisoners allowed the guards to carry out the proceedings away from the sounds of other prisoners, as there would be a large crack from the opening of the trapdoor which could audibly be heard throughout the prison. At Newgate, the gallows beam that emerged was wide enough to be able to accommodate 4 prisoners side by side, and then a new gallows in 1881 was created with 2 uprights, and then a crossbeam. There were in the crossbeam iron bands in the centre fixed, and then a number of chains dangled from this, and the rope was attached to it above the trapdoor. There was a pulley also for the trapdoor, which was operated on the platform by a lever, which could be pushed, and there were bales of cotton piled up to muffle the noises. Before 1884, different counties were responsible for providing the gallows, for being able to carry out death sentences in their county, and there were many different designs and each had different quirks. But then the standard gallows emerged, and this was what was used across the nation, and the beam of this was long enough to execute 3 prisoners side by side, and the trapdoors were made from 3-inch thick oak, which was released from the floor of the execution chamber, and these improvements to the design made executions quicker. The short drop method, as it became known, was used up until the later 1800s, and the final woman to be executed in this manner was Mary Ann Barry at Gloucester in January 1874. She struggled for 3 minutes after the drop fell. The protocols for the executions using the new drop at Newgate were recorded and published, and these were the first written execution procedures. It was stated that the 120 constables be summoned to attend, that proper posts and rails be fixed to prevent any carriages coming up and down the Old Bailey, each prisoner to give notice in writing to the sheriff prior to the day of execution of the name of one friend to be admitted to him, the time of execution to be precisely 9 o'clock, the sheriff's officers to be summoned to attend in their gowns and with javelins, the execution to take place as soon after the prisoner comes up to the scaffold, as the nature and decorum of the awful scene will admit, the scaffold and passage to be completely fixed by 8 o'clock and not later, that the friends of each culprit do send a shell, open coffin, to Newgate at 7 o'clock in the evening of the day preceding the execution, constables to attend the then removal of the scaffold. The following regulations are to be observed on the day of execution: the sheriff's officers, 20 in number, with their javelins, within the first railing of the scaffold, 4 without javelins to halter, noose and bring out the criminals. The constables, under the direction of the city marshals, are to be placed in close order around the outer rail to preserve the peace and permit no person within them. Of course, later drop executions became the norm all around the world, with different gallows being created, and also different executioners making tweaks as to how they perform the procedures on the structure. The new drop was the first pioneering drop gallows, and this would be used for centuries inside of different countries, and would take the lives of some of history's most ruthless criminals. In America, there were a number of executioners who tried to change tried and tested methods of execution, and this was to eradicate botches and to make things go more seamlessly during the process of condemning and executing a prisoner. There had been many botches inside of the land, and one of the most infamous to occur happened with the execution of the outlaw, Black Jack Tom Ketchum. This occurred in 1901 inside of Union County, and the rope was far too long for the execution, and the result of this was that the famous outlaw's head was taken clean off as he was sent crashing through the gallows. One man who witnessed his execution claimed that, and I quote, "He walked up firmly to the steps, saying as he went up, 'Dig my grave deep, boys.' Stepping upon the trap door, he asked for the black cap, and it was placed over his head, but it had to be removed to permit the rope to be placed on his neck, and whilst they delayed somewhat, he became impatient and said, 'Let her go, boys.' The sheriff cut the trigger rope with a hatchet, and his body shot down with all of its 215 pounds of weight. Everyone within or without the stockade held their breath, and their hearts gave a great bound of horror when it was seen that his head had been severed from his body by the fall. His body alighted squarely upon its feet, stood for a moment, swayed, and fell, and then great streams of red blood spurted from his severed neck, as if to shame the very ground upon which it poured. The head rolled aside, and the rope released, bounded high, and fell with a thud upon the scaffold from whence it came. This was not just a one-off, and because of this different inventors tried to create new execution methods. But one innovation was known as the Julian gallows. This was named after an architect, James Julian, who invented the method, and the concept behind this was that the gallows could be operated without the need of a hangman or an executioner. Thought was given at the time for the minds of executioners, skilled men who worked in the practice of taking lives through legal means, and there were concerns about the sense of guilt or the damage that carrying out many executions could have upon someone. Because of this, James Julian came up with an alternative gallows, and this worked with the prisoner being led up to the gallows structure by the stairs. Then the rope would be placed around the neck of the condemned, and as the victim was stood on the trap door, then a lever would be moved. This would then pull a plug from a water barrel nearby, and then slowly the barrel of water emptied, and the float would drop, and then a lever would move and quickly pull away the latch or locking mechanism on the trapdoor. This meant that by standing on the trapdoor, the prisoner was responsible for his or her execution, and the hangman was not, who would usually of course push a lever and then the trapdoor would open. The executioner would still be needed to secure the rope around the prisoner's neck, but then he could take a step back and watch proceedings rather than be the one who caused the death. The idea behind this is that the prisoner hanged themselves rather than the executioner doing it, and it was an execution device used across a number of different states in America. This included the states of Colorado, Wyoming, and Idaho. Inside of Connecticut, there was a slight tweak made to the Julian gallows, as they used lead shot rather than water, as the cold weather would cause the water to freeze, causing a number of problems, and they even had to postpone executions to warmer seasons because of this. One man who was executed in Wyoming using the Julian Gallows was the infamous American cowboy and Pinkerton agent Tom Horn. He was a man who was accused of committing 17 different killings in the West, as he worked as a hired gunman, and he was in 1902 convicted for the murder of a 14-year-old whose father had been involved in a feud with a neighbour. He was given an execution date following his trial of the 20th of November 1903, the day before his 43rd birthday. Tom Horn was one of a few people inside of the Wild West to be hanged using the Julian Gallows, or the water-powered gallows. He was executed in the same state and city as Julian the architect was from. He never gave up the names of those men who hired him to carry out his last killing, but the execution did not go well. The fall from the gallows was not sufficient enough, and was not long enough, and enough velocity could not be gained to snap his neck. Because of this, after the trapdoor was released by the mechanism, Tom Horn strangled for a slow 17 minutes until he succumbed to his death. It was not the most effective execution method, and showed that the real skill with hanging tended to come from the calculations and work of an executioner, the man tasked with carrying out the killing, rather than the equipment and structure used to perform the hanging on. The Julian Gallows remained in use in Wyoming until 1936, and there were successful executions using it, but different states then tended to switch to other methods of execution which were considered more humane, such as the electric chair or the gas chamber. There was another variation of the water-powered gallows created, as in Colorado, a similar machine was used. It was said that the warden of the state prison, Warden J. Lamping, or his deputy, George Dudley, along with a prison carpenter or local craftsman, made a machine similar in which the prisoner's own body weight was used to trigger the slow release of water from a jug. This would then drain, but would trigger a 300-pound weight to drop to the floor, and the condemned would then shoot up towards the ceiling and in the air, breaking the victim's neck in a more humane manner rather than using slow strangulation. This execution method did have a number of problems, and some claim that it caused executions to last almost an eternity, and sometimes as long as 4 minutes, not having the instant intended effect. This was in a sense a more of an upright jerker-style device, but it was still water-powered. The Julian Gallows did not really catch on in terms of its use, and although it was used for executions in America for a number of decades, it did not catch on and be used across different states except for a few. The idea was sound in the fact that it relieved an executioner of the burden of being the one who condemned and took the life of someone. However, in reality the structure was not well devised enough to snap the neck of someone instantly. Inside of Britain, executions tended to go smoother as executioners developed their craft, and men such as Albert Pierpoint actually meticulously calculated the long drops needed to snap the neck of each of the condemned he was given to work with, based on their weight and height. The Julian Gallows was an execution method which today has been left to history. The upright jerker as an execution method emerged inside of America, and it was used throughout the 1800s and 1900s as a variation on hanging. It was a device which was aimed to replace the gallows, and instead of going through a drop on a scaffold platform, then the point of the upright jerker was to send the condemned into the air. There was a number of shocking hangings which went terribly wrong throughout the years, for example the execution of Black Jack Tom Ketchum. The cowboy and outlaw was arrested and was condemned in public by hanging in Union County in April 1901. But the execution went terribly wrong, as the executioner used a rope that was much too long, and the result of this was that his head came off as he plunged through the gallows. One witness to this said, "He walked firmly up the steps, saying as he went up, 'Dig my grave deep, boys.' Stepping upon the trapdoor, he asked for the black cap, and it was placed over his head, but it had to be removed to permit the rope to be placed on the neck, and whilst this delayed somewhat, he became impatient and said, 'Let her go, boys.' The sheriff cut the trigger rope with a hatchet, and his body shot down, with all its 215 pounds of weight. Everyone within or without the stockade held their breath, and their hearts gave a great bound of horror when it was seen that the head had been severed from the body by the fall. His body alighted squarely upon its feet, stood for a moment, swayed, and fell, and then great streams of red blood spurted from his severed neck, as if to shame the ground upon which it poured. The head rolled aside, and the rope released, bounded high, and fell, with a thud upon the scaffold from whence it came. The upright jerker, as you would probably guess, was aimed to push the condemned into the air, in a jerking motion upwards. This was done as a noose was secured around the neck of the condemned, as was done normally with hangings. However, rather than the condemned being plunged through a trapdoor, through a scaffold, with the release of a platform underneath them, there was a system of weights and pulleys that was released, which would send the condemned into the air, and the aim of this was to instantly snap the neck of the condemned in a quicker manner, and to prevent botchings occurring like as in what happened to Black Jack Ketchum. However, the warden of Connecticut's State Prison obtained a patent in June 1895 for the creation and use of an automatic gallows, as in the upright jerker device. There were executions using this style gallows that occurred in the States, in different places including Connecticut, and specifically Gerald Chapman, a murderer, was executed on the jerker. Chapman was known as a gentleman bandit, and he was the first criminal documented in the press to have been public enemy number 1, and he lost his life on the device. But in terms of its effectiveness, it did not really work to snap the neck of the condemned quickly, in the manner that was intended. Instead, the victim would be hoisted up into the air, the noose tightened around the neck, and they would then be strangled in mid-air, left kicking and struggling for sometimes minutes until death came. One man who was executed in 1860 on the device, a man named James Stevens, suffered a botched execution. When the upright jerker was released and the weights flung him into the air, his neck did not snap, and it was documented that he was left contorting, struggling, and gurgling until the life was choked out of him over a number of minutes. Eventually the device was retired, and the gallows with a trapdoor was more favoured inside of American prisons and inside of law. But the upright jerker was an execution device which was a variation on the gallows, and it was not the most effective in its use. It was intended to solve issues with reliability and botches, but it did none of the sort, and actually made executions more problematic for the executioners. Some prisons did continue to use the jerker, but it was actually eradicated after a number of decades. Executioners trialled and tested different methods of hanging throughout the centuries, and in America they even developed a gallows that sent a condemned person high up into the air, and this was known as the upright jerker. On the whole, this wasn't successful, as there were more botches than successful executions, but all of the trials were done to avoid botching executions that were poorly performed. One of the worst executions conducted saw Black Jack Tom Ketchum lose his head on the gallows. It was said of this that he walked firmly up the stairs, saying as he went up, "Dig my grave deep, boys." Stepping upon the trapdoor, he asked for the black cap, and it was placed over his head, but it had to be removed to permit the rope to be placed on his neck, and whilst they delayed somewhat, he became impatient and said, "Let her go, boys." The sheriff cut the trigger rope with a hatchet, and his body shot down with all its 215 pounds of weight. Everyone within or without the stockade held their breath, and the hearts gave a great bound of horror when it was seen that his head had been severed from his body by the fall. His body alighted squarely upon its feet, stood for a moment, swayed and fell, and the great streams of red blood spurted from his neck, as if to shame the very ground upon which it poured. The head rolled aside, and the rope, released, bounded high and fell with a great thud upon the scaffold from whence it came. Even at the end of the Second World War, John C. Woods would botch the Nuremberg hangings in the 1940s, but inside of Austria there was a different execution method used. The hanging procedure often inside of Austria was not regulated and kept in check by legislation, and different hangings were carried out by executioners who operated within the nation. The decision on how a hanging should be carried out was decided by local officials and government, and there were also no special gallows used for hangings, unlike in England, when the new drop gallows was devised. Usually the hanging rope would be tied to a tree, and the victim was hoisted up and placed on a platform, such as a chair, and this was kicked out from underneath them, and the victim would die from slow strangulation. There were also inside of Austria no professional or state-appointed hangmen, and the executioners were usually policemen or men who had worked as bodyguards. Many lands which fell under the influence and control of the Austrian Empire used shooting also as a legal method of execution, and this was the case when the Yugoslav kingdom was established in 1918, but the nation retained Austrian laws, and in these, executions were to be carried out using the hanging, which were to be performed by a professional hangman appointed by the government. In 1929, inside of Yugoslavia, a penal code was adopted which stipulated in certain parts of the nation that hanging was the only method of execution to be carried out, and this was to be done on what was referred to as the Austrian gallows. This was a single wooden post, in which there was a metal hook at the top, where the noose was to be attached, and then at the back of the post was a small platform for the executioner to stand on. The condemned were walked up to the post, and they were then stood on a wooden box with their back to the post, and the executioner then placed a noose around their neck, and usually a piece of cloth or a cap over their face, so that the crowd could not see the final moments. When the executioner gave the signal that he was ready, his assistant then kicked the box from underneath the prisoner's feet, and pulled down on the body by the legs. The weight of the body then tightened the noose and caused death. However, this was said to have took around 10 minutes to occur. Hangings at this time were usually carried out on the Austrian gallows within the walls of a prison, so that the general public could not see what was happening, and appointed to oversee the execution were judicial inspectors, a doctor, and also a priest. The priest would provide spiritual guidance to the condemned in their final moments, but the doctor was there to confirm that death had occurred with the stopping of the heart. Also allowed to witness the execution were 2 representatives of the local community, the prisoner's closest relatives and the defence counsel, as well as local police and law officials. Some honourable male citizens could also apply to witness executions on the Austrian gallows, but many people managed to gain access to witness these executions without having the proper permission. But sometimes the executions were much more public. For example, in 1925, a crowd of over 3,000 men, women and even children had gathered inside the yard of a district court to witness a hanging on the Austrian gallows. The Austrian gallows was also used to hang people simultaneously on different posts, and each of the condemned were brought out separately, so they could not witness the executions of the others. The judgment was not usually read, but was printed out and distributed amongst the witnesses. It was a variation of pole hanging, which was used also during the Second World War, where a prisoner had a system of ropes and pulleys tied around them, and they would be secured in the air by a chest sling across them. The executioner and his assistant then passed a system of ropes through the top and bottom of the pole, and when ready the chest sling was released. As the condemned jerked downwards, the executioner manually dislocated the neck, pushing the head to one side, and death was said to have occurred in a matter of minutes. This was very similar to the Austrian gallows, and was much more technical than when it was first used, and when performed right, it could be carried out very quickly. After execution was carried out on the Austrian gallows, the body of the condemned was usually left on the post for some time, possibly even hours, and then under the cover of nightfall, they would be cut down and buried in the evening, within the local cemetery, if this was allowed. The body was also at times given to the family of the condemned, if they wanted to bury them in their own family plots. But at the end of the Second World War, inside of different lands, post-hanging or the Austrian gallows took the lives of many high-ranking war criminals, such as Kurt de Luger, Karl Hermann Frank, and Ferenc Salazzi. These men were prominent politicians and officials who worked for the Nazis or were in collaboration with them, and their actions resulted in the execution and torture of thousands of people, with their own executions being conducted in public. Salazzi, for example, was a politician who was executed on the post, along with many other people. The Austrian gallows were also used to execute a number of women who had collaborated with the German enemy. But the Austrian gallows was an execution method which was adopted by nations who had lived under Austrian influence, and in Yugoslavia they decided to keep the laws of the Austrians, and with this they deployed the Austrian gallows to take the lives of many people. It was an execution method which saw someone slowly strangled to death, initially after a period of about 10 minutes, but then different modifications were made to make someone succumb to their ordeal quicker on the Austrian gallows. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.